Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on the time zone you're following us from, and also depending whether you're watching us live or if you're watching a recording. Today, we'll continue our series on topics related to cyberbullying. And today, we'll be having a guest from the UK that I'll be introducing shortly. And we have also a very interesting topic, as we'll be talking about digital resilience, and also we'll be talking about curriculum for digital to promote digital resilience. As always, those who are following us are welcome to announce themselves in comments, say that they are following us, where they're following us from, and it's always nice to see those who follow these sessions. As António João Silva says, good evening, Tito, boa noite in Portuguese. If other people are also following, we're already half a dozen of us. Feel free to get into the comments and let us know where you're seeing us from. As I was saying, today we have a very interesting topic. We'll be talking about digital resilience and digital resilience curriculum. Digital resilience is the secret sauce that helps young people to flourish in the digital world. How can parents, teachers, and friends support digital resilience, and how do we stop doing things we know don't work? That is basically the topic for our conversation tonight. And to talk us about this topic, we have Vicki Shotbolt, founder and CEO of Parent Zone. Vicki is the founder and CEO of Parent Zone, an organization that helps parents and families to navigate the challenges of a connected world. An executive board member of the UK Council for Internet Safety and co-chair of the UKCIS Digital Resilience Working Group, Vicki leads a team that reaches millions of families every year. So, welcome, Vicki. And first of all, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to be part of this series that we're doing on topics related to cyberbullying. We already have other people joining, namely Bílio Carvalho says good night from Vila Nova de Gaia. If you're not familiar, Vicki, with Vila Nova de Gaia, is a neighboring city from the city where I live, which is Porto, mostly famous for the port wine. So it's right across the river. But as I was saying, welcome to our show. And perhaps we should start by you letting us know a bit more about your background. I know, as I've said, that you are now CEO and founder of Parent Zone, but what's your background? You worked in telecommunications as well, didn't you?
No, I didn't actually.
No,
okay. I don't come from an industry background. I come from a children's charity background, actually. I used to work for a children's charity in the UK called Children's Society. And after, I don't know, about 10 years working there, I had my own son and became more and more interested in parenting. Of course, the two things are completely connected. Working in a children's charity, you become very aware of the really critical role that parents have in children's outcomes. You know, if there's a parenting deficit, then that is usually part of the issues that lead to a child ending up in the care of a children's charity. So two things kind of converged. One, my own experience of being a parent, but the other, my experience of working with children who almost by definition had a parenting deficit of one kind or another. So I became the deputy chief executive of an organisation in the UK that focused specifically on making the UK a bit more family friendly and thinking about how we could provide support to parents. Because the UK is historically bad at supporting parents, unlike most of the rest of Europe.
Okay. So that's how Parent Zone came about. Then it was because of your interest in that arena.
Yeah, absolutely, it came from a children's rights perspective to begin with, and then through a figuring out of how we might provide better support to parents. Parent Zone came along at just about the same time that the connected world was really taking off. Parent Zone predates things like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all of those platforms, but what it did coincide with was the internet going mobile. And that's where parenting and technology, for me, came together, and a recognition of the fact that parents and families were going to need an awful lot of help to figure out a way through this new connected world.
Okay, and you also referenced on your bio that you co-chaired the working group for digital resilience with the UK Council. Can you tell us a little bit about the UK Council for Internet Safety?
Well, the UK Council for Internet Safety is 10 years old now. So it was originally set up under Prime Minister Gordon Brown, and it was very ahead of its time, really. It was a government saying we actually need to bring together industry, NGOs, academics, experts to figure out what we need to do to make sure that the internet is as safe as it can be for children. That was 10 years ago. It's had successful moments and not so successful moments, but it continues as a forum that brings together that really wide range of expertise to figure out how we get the policies right, how we get the education piece right, and how we make sure that families are supported and we're focusing on the right things.
Okay, so it's basically an advisory board for the UK government?
Exactly, and it's chaired by 3 UK ministers. So we have the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, the UK's Home Office, and the UK's Department for Education, and the ministers all come together and chair this board.
Okay. António João Silva is also saying good evening, Vicky. So he's welcoming you. The other question would be, what does the UK Council for Internet Safety do? We've more or less covered that. But how did the need to develop a policy paper for digital resilience came about? How was it felt, and how was it decided that there was a need for to develop such a policy paper?
We have had an interesting journey towards digital resilience in the UK, I would say. We had a policy 5 years ago, 6 years ago, of the government encouraging our broadband suppliers to produce filters and tools and blocks, and we were very hopeful that filtering would fix this problem. When I say we, the government was very hopeful that filters would make the internet a safe place for children. Our work at the Parent Zone had always led us to understand that tools were not going to be the solution. So we started working on digital resilience in 2008 with the Oxford Internet Institute, thinking about that question of whether or not filters were going to do it, or whether we needed to think about resilience, which, as you described it, is the magic sauce. And initially the government weren't at all interested, quite frankly. They thought that it was not part of their plan to force industry to come up with tools that would solve the problem. But gradually, as those tools failed, demonstrably failed, the notion of thinking more seriously about digital resilience came to the fore. And ministers said, actually, we do need to look at this seriously, and we need to think about how we embed a resilience approach in our schools and in our NGOs and in our industry friends. So at that point, we set up the working group to think about how you could make it happen.
Okay. So I've understood it. It's the thing with filters in the UK. It's been going back and forth issue, isn't it? Uh, as I thought that you had mandatory filtering at internet service providers. So internet service providers had to provide mandatory filtering, and you had to say that I don't want filtering in order to if you didn't want it. Is it?
It's not mandatory.
Uh-huh.
Every broadband provider has to offer them. Some
Okay.
broadband providers, most actually now, turn them on by default, and then when you set up your broadband, you have to opt out, so you have to decide to turn them off, which is something that most parents decide to do, actually.
Mhm.
So it's not mandatory in the sense that everybody has to use them, but it's certainly there as the default setting when your broadband is put in.
Okay. Uh, but this filter just was a personal question and not related to the digital resilience issue. But I find it interesting that the fact that were NGOs realizing that the solution is not a technical one, because the problem is not a technical problem, but it's a problem of a behavioral problem on how people relate to each other and they connect to each other and so forth. So, what is the purpose of this working group, and what's the purpose of developing this policy paper, basically?
The main purpose of the group is to help organisations and individuals to think with a resilience approach. So instead of continually trying to find a tool that's going to fix it, to actually think about some of those behavioural issues and how we can use resilience and harness that approach instead. So the point of producing the framework, the thing about resilience is that it's a term that lots of people have heard, and
Right.
dare I say it's become a little bit fashionable,
Mm-hmm.
incredibly misunderstood, and turning it from a phrase that sounds like a good idea into something that you can actually do and you can actually implement is a little bit more complicated. And the point of the framework is to help people do that, to help them start to put in place ways of working that are supporting children's resilience instead of undermining it.
Okay. So basically, by letting people know without a doubt what is resilience. By one of the things that with this series that we've come to realize is most of the guests that we've had have been telling us, and something that we already had realized is one of the problems that cyberbullying has, and all the studies that cyberbullying has, is we find different definitions, studies done with different definitions, and that leads to results that cannot be compared. So I perfectly understand that having one definition of what is digital resilience can be tremendously helpful. So that leads us to the question: what is digital resilience?
Um, Maybe I should start by saying what it's not. So
Okay.
resilience is often thought of as the ability to bounce back. That
Mhm.
something bad happens and you pick yourself up, bounce back and get back on the bicycle or horse or whatever it is that you've fallen off. And actually resilience is that's a very poor definition of what resilience is. So
Mhm.
the way we define resilience is that it is a personality asset. So it's not a trait. It's not like having blonde hair or wearing glasses. It's something that everybody has, but it changes. It's dynamic. So sometimes you have more of it, and sometimes you have less of it. And it's like keeping fit. You have to keep working at your resilience in order to maintain it. So that's the kind of top level definition of digital resilience. It's a dynamic personality asset, and it's got
Mhm.
4 components, which I think I sent you a slide with the 4 components on that.
Yes, you did. I'll
uh,
show it.
Flash up. So there they are. It's about understanding when an individual is at risk. It's about knowing what to do to get help, recovering when things go wrong, and then learning from that experience so that you can re-engage with the environment, but perhaps make appropriate changes to minimize the risk.
Mm-hmm.
And the critical thing about digital resilience is that it is not possible to develop digital resilience without being in a digital environment.
Mm-hmm.
So abstinence is not a way of developing digital resilience, and that's a really important message for certainly parents in the UK who sometimes feel that what they actually like to do is to just stop their children using all this tech or minimize the amount of time they're spending on it.
Okay. Not only the policy paper defines 4 areas in which it will impact in the defined environment, content, service, and policy. Would you like to give us a short description of what those domains are?
The idea of the different domains is it's really a recognition of the fact that absolutely everybody can play their part in supporting a child's digital resilience. Or equally, to put it another way, every domain can play a role in undermining digital resilience. So if you think about the policy context, bad policy making will undermine a child's digital resilience, perhaps by saying children shouldn't be allowed on the internet at all in school, for example. That would be an example of a policy that was not resilience friendly. If we think about environment, that might be the place that you are going on the internet. So that could be anything from a library to a home. If you think about the context, that could be that you're doing it in an education setting and you're doing it with a teacher or with a parent. And what we wanted to do with the framework was to make sure that we separated out those different environments so that you could take an appropriate part of the resilience journey and apply it to the particular context that you could influence.
Okay, so these are also stakeholders, basically, we could be talking about, like internet service providers when we talk about environment, educational publishers when we're talking about content, service and policy likewise. We've gone through what digital resilience is. How can we say that I have it and you don't, or vice versa? How is it established, basically, so that we can identify it whether I have it or not?
That's a really good question. There are attributes that you can see in a person that you would regard as resilient. So things like planning, managing risk effectively, making sensible choices and not being unduly impacted about an online experience and returning to that online experience that is negatively impacting you. So you can, a child who is not particularly resilient is likely to be presenting with problems because their resilience has been compromised. If they were resilient, then they would be managing those problems in a slightly different way, or they would be accessing help and support. And that's really, really important. This isn't about toughening children up to face whatever the internet throws at them. It's about making sure that they have support when they need it and that they have knowledge about how to manage their risks. So a child who isn't resilient is likely to be a child who's experiencing harm online or taking inappropriate levels of risk. A child who is resilient is one who is making smart choices, who is coping with life online and flourishing. And that's another part of the resilience messaging, really. It's not, safety isn't enough. We've never thought at Parent Zone that safety was enough. It's important. It's very, very important. But the reason that we want children to be safe, or one of the reasons we want children to be safe, is because we want them to go on and benefit from all these wonderful things that the internet can offer. So for us, that's just the housekeeping. We get them safe first, and then it's because we want them to flourish. And a child who's digitally resilient has the skills they need to flourish online, not just avoid harm.
Mm-hmm. So can we say that kids that are not resilient are more prone to risky behaviors?
Well,
Online and offline, basically. Mm-hmm.
yes and no. So risk-taking is part of building your resilience. Okay, so we want children to take risks because that is how they will learn and develop.
Sure.
And that's true offline and online. What we don't want them to do is take inappropriate levels of risk, or to take a risk that results in a problem and then not know how to get help to sort that out, or to take a risk and then not learn from that experience and carry on taking that risk. So it isn't necessarily the risk-taking in and of itself that's problematic. It's how they take those risks and how appropriate those risks are to them.
Okay. Adelina Silva has also joined us, and she says, good evening. Good evening, Adelina. Nice to have you with us. Always welcome. And just a reminder, if any of you has any questions or comments that would like to ask Vicki, so please leave them in the comments, and I'll bring them into our conversation. So how can we develop resilience, digital resilience in our kids?
Well, and that's kind of what the whole framework is about. Everybody can play a part in supporting a child's digital resilience. So the first thing is, don't ban technology. It's really important that you, as a parent, that you embrace technology and you think of it in a positive way. Your starting point has to be, this is an opportunity for my child that I want them to benefit from, and my job as a parent is to help them navigate it safely. And that navigating it safely is about making sure that they understand when they're in a risky situation and that they have the skills to manage that risky situation properly. Just as you would teach a child how to cross the road, it's a heck of a lot more complicated than teaching a child to cross the road, but fundamentally it's the same principle. I'm not going to stop you doing something, I'm going to show you how to do it safely. And having high expectations of your children, I mean, it's one of the things that we talk about a lot in parenting, and it's one of the things that's very well researched in parenting, that it's really important to set high expectations for your children and then help them to achieve those expectations with warmth and support and appropriate boundaries and all of that stuff that parents do day in, day out. It's exactly the same online.
One of the things that the policy paper features, you've already mentioned it, is the features associated with resilience, and basically is what you've shared with the slide that we've shown, and it means understand, know, learn, and recover. And the question now is, how can we support resilience? You were saying that we all have a role to play. Okay, what's our role, for instance, as parents?
I think, as I said, the first thing is to recognize that it's something that you want your children to have. And in order for them to have it, they've got to learn how to use the internet well. They've got to learn how to recognize risk. They've got to know how to manage that risk safely. One of the things that we find, certainly with schools, but I think the same is probably also true for parents, is that quite often in this resilience method, the moment that you realize your child has got an issue is when they come to you for help with recovery. So recovery is quite often the entry point to resilience for lots and lots of people. And it's a very, very important moment, helping a child to recover, but then re-engage with the digital world with perhaps better skills to manage it, or the ability to make better choices about what they're doing online is absolutely critical, helping a child recover. And that recovery process can happen in all sorts of contexts. It could be a platform that deals with a report well. So instead of a report going into a black hole, the child getting a response that says, we've heard your complaint and we have dealt with it, is a very important part of recovery. A parent who says to a child, something's gone wrong, you've done something I told you not to do, therefore I'm going to take away your iPad, or therefore I'm going to say you're not allowed to use Instagram anymore, or any of those things that it's quite tempting to do. I think we've all been tempted to go there when a child's broken one of your rules, but that doesn't really support recovery, and it's not going to get your child back on that circle of resilience.
And the same goes with the other three aspects: learn, know, and understand. One of the things that I found really interesting is, instead of waiting for the recovery, the policy paper provides a self-assessment. So each of the players in these four domains that the paper identifies: environment, content, service, and policy, can assess where they are on digital resilience. Do you want to go a bit into what this self-assessment assesses, basically, for each of these in these areas?
It's very straightforward, really. We think of it as a reflection tool as much as anything else, and it's kind of applying a process so that if you're, for example, developing some resources for children, you're doing some content for children, you think about all four aspects of digital resilience so that you don't inadvertently forget one element of it. So the kind of classic example is understanding when you're at risk. Maybe a parent that would say to a child, I don't want you to use or play that game, let's say, isn't going as far as they could go to help a child understand why that might be a risk. Whereas a parent who says, I don't want you to use that game because I'm concerned about the live streaming features, I'm concerned about the fact that you'll be able to chat with people that aren't in your age range, that parent is helping a child to start to understand the features that mean there are risks in that game. And so the checklist is really about helping people to think, I'm doing this over here, but does it have an unintended consequence in another part of the resilience? And it does that just by asking some really, really simple questions. None of this is rocket science. And the framework is, hopefully, you found it relatively straightforward. I think anybody could pick it up and use it.
Yeah, that's the feeling I got. We got a few questions. Adelina Silva is asking, in a society where parents and teachers try to protect children from digital danger, how can one teach resilience to adversities?
I think it is about thinking about those different influences. And the one, if you're thinking about teaching resilience, I think the one that's particularly helpful is thinking about enabling a child to manage risk and to be able to manage risk, which is one of life's big skills, isn't it? Figuring out how you manage risk in your life is one of the big things that we've all got to get to grips with. And we know children, particularly teenagers, are not all that great at. But that's one of the ways that you can really teach resilience. And that is about explaining what the risks actually are. It's not about saying you can't do that. It's about saying you can't do that because, so that you start to give children autonomy and the ability to plan and the ability to internalize rules and understand why these things are important.
Okay, let me tell Adelina that we will also be going through what Parentzone has developed as a digital resilience curriculum later on during this session. Antonio Palma is also saying, so Adelina, keep your ears with us because we'll be talking about that. Antonio Palma says, good evening, how can parents teach children if they don't know for them? Como podem os pais ensinar as crianças sem... Okay, how can parents teach children if they don't know, for instance, some of the realities? How can I teach, for instance, my child the risks of, let's say, Minecraft or whatever platform or app, or if I'm not familiar with them?
And I think that it's really important to acknowledge that this is not just a job for parents. This is a job that everybody has a role in. It's a job for schools, it's a job for industry, and parents have to play their part. Parents don't have to know every functionality of every single app or every single game. What's important is that they set sensible rules and boundaries, like if somebody is using bad language or being unkind in a game, or if you experience behavior that I wouldn't accept offline, then you shouldn't accept it in your game or in your environment. Those sorts of offline rules that parents set all the time are really applicable online and kind of sidestep this issue. I think parents too often get hung up on I don't understand the tech, therefore I don't have a role to play, when in fact parents have lots of knowledge about behaviours that are just as applicable online as they are offline.
Absolutely, and I think it's a question of dialogue. If we keep, it's very easy for me to say, "Oh, I don't know anything about Minecraft or Fortnite or whatever." That's very easy to say, and it's basically a way of escaping and say it's not my problem; it's somebody else's problem. But in parenting, you have to know.
You do.
And you have to sit by your son and your daughter and try to learn what you don't know, because you also have some background and information and things you have learned throughout your life that might be helpful for your child. So even if you not knowing, I usually say, is not the problem. The problem usually is when people don't want to know. Then the problems usually start coming up. Billy Carvalho also asks, what if instead of resilience, we prepare children not to fall into the trap of social networks?
I don't know why you would not want to support resilience in your child, or in yourself even. I think resilience is an asset that we all want to nurture. So I wouldn't put it as an instead of. Helping children not to fall into the traps of social networks, depending what those traps are. Is that trap that you end up spending far too much time on social networks, or is it that you're worried about giving your data away on social networks? I think these are complicated tools that play an important part in a child's life, and you have to understand what that part is so that you can help them to navigate their way through it. But social networks are, they're complicated things that children are going to use.
Absolutely. So Adelina listened to me and she says, okay, so she'll be listening to the other part. As I was saying, the policy paper ends with a self-assessment checklist that you can go through, and as you said, is very easy to understand. It's not a very big paper, so it's something that is also easy to read, and it also can be used along with another document, which is the digital resilience framework itself, that is also available for download on the link below. Do you want to expand on how these two documents complement each other and how we can use them individually or together?
I guess the policy document is if you really want to do a deep dive into digital resilience and you're maybe thinking about implementing a digital resilience approach across, let's say, a school or an organisation. The digital resilience framework is if you want to just pick it up, use it, do the checklist, and you're not. So some of the organisations that are using the full policy document are local government, for example, where they're putting together in multiple different settings a resilience approach. So I guess it depends how deep you want to dive. Do you want the quickie tool that you can use? Anybody can use it in any context, and then the framework will get you started. If you love using the framework and you want to do a little bit more, and you really want more info, then go for the full policy document. Ideally, go.
Another important point to mention, I believe, is the fact that being a government developed paper is also free to use.
Yes.
And people can take it and develop their own, use it within their own organizations, adapt it, and even develop it further if they think it's sort of it's not an open source document, but it's a similar license, I believe.
Yeah.
And it's within that principle, I believe, that Parent Zone has also developed the digital resilience curriculum. Is that right?
That's right, yeah. So that curriculum was developed for youth in schools particularly, and that's to help schools actually. It includes lesson plans and resources that educators can use to work with young people.
Mm-hmm. And is this curriculum available for free, or is it something that you have to purchase? How does it work?
The one that you're showing there is the curriculum that's for our members and membership. There is a fee for membership. Mm-hmm. We have other resources on the website, digital resilience resources that you find on our homepage actually, that are completely free. So the particular one that you were showing there is our membership one, but we have all of our resources fundamentally are part of a digital resilience approach.
Okay, and are there any plans on developing or adapting your curriculum to Portuguese, for instance?
Well, interestingly enough, we did a program called Digital Life Skills, which is a digital resilience-based program, and it's designed for parents, and that is translated into Portuguese.
Really?
Yeah. So on our website, on the homepage, there's a section, I think it's called Parent Zone International. It's got, I can't quite remember the heading for the section, but it's right there on our homepage. And if people go to that section on our homepage, they'll find our digital life skills resources in Portuguese.
Okay, so can you give us some highlights on what we can find within your on Parent Zone digital resilience curriculum?
That focuses on the behaviours that we want to encourage in children. So it has exercises that people can do around developing empathy in their child, so that they're more likely to think about the experience of another internet user, which is a good way of helping them to reflect on their own experiences, but also empathy between parents and children. So that thing that you were talking about parents actually really having to understand what their children do online and having to understand the platforms. There's a whole part of the curriculum is around about building that empathetic understanding of each other's experiences of the digital world. Then there are practical resources in there that explain what digital resilience is and how you can support recovery and how you can encourage children to understand when they're at risk.
Okay, and another thing is it just for schools, or is it something that parents can use at home with their kids?
We have different resources for different audiences. So the digital life skills resource I was talking about earlier on, that one's designed for parents to use with their children. The curriculum is, as the name suggests, that one is designed for educators.
Okay, and for instance, are the resources and the curriculum itself, is it for any particular age group, or is it for grades 1 to 12?
It's actually split into two different resources. So one for older children, 13 to 18-year-olds, and one for younger children, and it goes down to 8-year-olds. You could go a little bit younger than that with them, but fundamentally it's for 8-year-olds and up.
Okay, very interesting. Well, this more or less covers the questions I had on the digital resilience framework and the curriculum. And all those that are following us will find more information by having access to the documents using the URLs that I've mentioned. But we still have some time. Would you like to let us know about the work that you're developing at Parent Zone? Because, for instance, I believe you developed a paper also on gaming, on how some gaming platforms are being used more like gambling than actually gaming.
We have done a lot of work looking at initially gambling, so skin gambling, which is primarily amongst PC gamers, where they go to third-party sites and use virtual currency to gamble and thereby get around gambling laws. That was our first piece of work, looking at the gambling that was happening amongst young people. And we did that because children told us that they thought it was a problem. From that piece of work, we've just published a report called The Rip-Off Games, and that looks at the funding model that underpins the gaming industry. And we think that funding model is flawed and it needs to change. And kind of at the heart of that model is the freemium model that is relying on children spending hundreds of pounds on in-app purchases, hundreds of euros as well, on in-app purchases. And particularly, we're concerned about the loot box phenomenon, which is in effect introducing children to gambling.
Yeah, but I saw on that arena, for instance, that the UK Gaming Authority was also concerned with that, and they signed a declaration together with other 14 European gaming authorities, saying that loot boxes are basically gambling. But apparently the UK has stepped back on that. Can you update us on the situation?
The UK have actually had a consultation out recently. It's only relatively recently closed, looking at this question and trying to figure out what decision we ought to make about loot boxes. So I wouldn't say that they have stepped back. I'd say that what they're doing at the moment is trying to figure out. Some countries have already decided that loot boxes are a form of gambling. Others haven't. The UK is looking at it and deciding what the right next steps are. Parliament in the UK is not in a great place at the moment to get anything.
Other things to worry about, I've heard. So far, I've heard.
To be very honest, we're not doing great when it comes to our policy making at the moment.
Yeah. Okay. And besides the gambling aspects of gaming, are there other issues that really worry you? For instance, there's a big debate regarding Facebook implementation of head-to-head encryption, and how can that be detrimental to child's protection? And on one way, we have child protection organizations asking not against encryption, and we have groups usually on human rights and things like that, that are pro encryption, and it's a tough balance. I've been looking into the thing, and I find merits on both positions, and I would like to know what are your thoughts on the matter. I don't have a position defined on it. I'm trying to figure it out because it's not easy.
It's not easy, and the truthful answer is that we don't have a position on it either yet. The concerns that people have about their data and their privacy online and what social media platforms are able to do with the information they're sharing are real and worrying concerns, and end-to-end encryption would help with that.
Yeah.
So absolutely, there's a privacy imperative that would make us supportive of end-to-end encryption.
Sure.
But there is that balance, which is, what do you then do about the additional risks that poses to children? It's a very difficult circle to square.
Absolutely.
It doesn't answer your question at all. I just think that is one, and I think again and again, the digital world is throwing up these questions that we haven't had to wrap our head around before,
Yeah.
and there are perfect answers to them. I think that's the real challenge for us all. There is never a perfect solution.
Absolutely. And are there any other areas of concern that Parent Zone is looking into besides these two ones that we've mentioned?
I think there are two more that we are particularly interested in. One is around young people's mental health. And that's not that we think that the internet is causing the problem with young people's mental health, but that it could be a way of really supporting children's mental health, and we ought to be leveraging it for good and not for bad. And B, it's a huge area that we are looking at and trying to figure out how we can provide support to parents. So we're developing a tool called Ollie, which is designed to help parents and children communicate well around that mental health space. And then the other area that we're really interested in, which I think loads of people are, is this question of fake news, deep fakes, media literacy. How do you help children, all of us actually, get to the good information and avoid the bad information? And for children, one of the areas that we're aware of that was brought up to us by young guys actually is the amount of bad health information that they are consuming online. So that whole space of what kind of information are we trying to wade our way through, and how do we do it, is a really big issue for us.
Mm-hmm. The US, and I'm not really sure whether the UK has also moved into that direction. We're talking about how some platforms and applications and digital devices in general can sometimes have functionalities like loot boxes, for instance, that can be detrimental to people, can be addictive, and can also have other impacts, like you were saying, the fake news problems and the polarization that we've been seeing in societies, mainly the UK, the US, Brazil has also experienced that political polarization. And in the US, they've tried to address that through legislation, which they meant to address the dangers of dark patterns that they have identified within the applications. Is there also a movement in the UK to address those problems?
We have some legislation that's actually already gone through, which is called Safety by Design, and that is intended to put, as the name suggests, safety at the heart of the actual design of different platforms. And I think that's it's a really interesting development, because I think fundamentally that's where we need to get to, and it's kind of back to the digital resilience model. There isn't one part of the ecosystem that's going to make this work. it's going to take all parts, including the developers and the software engineers, to think about the safety of their users at the point of developing their services.
Mm-hmm. That's an item that I'm really interested on. Is something that I believe the industry started as a way to get people's attention, which is natural for a business that is based on attention. The more eyeballs I get to my ads, the more I'm going to make money wise. But they didn't look at all the implications. And there is also a movement in the industry, I feel, companies like Google and Facebook, that they have realized that some of the functionalities that they have embedded in their services can be detrimental to people. And they're starting with having well-being programs to address all those issues. So I think it's something that is also interesting and welcome. And it's in line with what you mentioned of your worries about the mental health impact that technologies can have on young people.
Industry wants to get this right too. I mean, I think we quite often talk about this in a fairly adversarial way, whereas in actual fact, it's not in anybody's interest, and it's certainly not in industry's interests for us all to lose trust in this technology that we love and have in our lives in such a significant way. So I do think that there is a move to figure out if we can do this better.
Definitely, Adelina Silva is saying that digital literacy, critical thinking are, in my point of view, skills that have to be developed, and definitely that's also a part of the equation. And I think this would get into the learn domain of the digital resilience. Well, we're reaching the hour, and I would like to know, Antonio Palma also says, and this is about the discussion we were having about encryption and the views for those for free speech and the impacts on child protection. And he says the worst is that the world doesn't think like the few that are concerned, and I'm not sure that there are so few. I think that it's quite a bit of people that are concerned on both sides, and that's why I think that encryption is on the table and will be an item for discussion for the next months at least, if not years. If anyone has any further questions, just leave them in the comments. I'll gladly bring them into the conversation. Meanwhile, let me just say that where you can find further information on Parent Zone and on the work that Vicki Shotbolt is developing. So I've already mentioned the UKCIS Digital Resilience Framework and the working paper, the curriculum, and you can find more and you can follow Vicki on Twitter. You can also find Parent Zone on Twitter, and they post there regularly. Vicki is also on LinkedIn, so you can also follow her there and get in touch with her there. And the same goes for Parent Zone. They also have a page on LinkedIn. Parent Zone has also an Instagram account that you can follow, and a YouTube channel that you can also subscribe to. And they also have a Facebook page that is always welcoming new fans. So feel free to drop by and say hi and click on the like button. And last but not least, the Parent Zone website at parentzone.org.uk, where you can find more resources, both for parents and for families. Vicki, I usually end by asking a question to our guest, and then I introduce the guest that is coming for the next session, and then I'll come back to you for your answer. So my question is, okay, if a school or a parent or a teacher or a school wants to develop the digital resilience of its sons or its students, what would be the first step that you would recommend? And think about it, and I'll be back in a minute. I'm going to introduce the guest for tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll be talking about resilience, but in Portuguese. There was a group of universities that, including a Portuguese university, that developed what they've called the European resilience curriculum, and it will be interesting to compare what we've been talking about today to what we'll be talking about tomorrow. The session will be in Portuguese, named Resiliência em Ação, and the guest will be Celeste Simões, who runs the program in Portugal. And this week, this will be the last session, but the following Monday, a week from today, we'll be back again with more guests for the final week, in which we'll celebrate Bullying Prevention Month and European Cybersecurity Month as well. So back to you, Vicki. So what would be your recommendation?
If it was a school asking us that question, the first thing I would say would be to abandon your rules and tools thinking, embrace a positive attitude to this, and see it not as internet safety, see it as an opportunity to help children flourish online. And once you flip your work around internet safety into something that's about opportunities and children flourishing, then the resilience will be essential, and you can then start to build a much better, more positive way of talking to children about technology.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Different looks. Start looking about not looking at an internet safety issue. Very interesting. Okay, Vicki, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to be here with us. Let me just check if there are any other comments or questions. No. So thank you very much for accepting my invitation to be here with us. It was great to have the opportunity to talk with you about digital resilience. I find the work that the UKCIS has developed really interesting, and it was an opportunity also to learn about the work that Parent Zone has been developing. Adelina Silva also joined us to say thank you very much for sharing the framework. To all those that have been following us, I've left the links, clickable links on comments, both on Facebook and on YouTube. So you can just click the links to have access to both the framework and the policy paper, and also to the Parent Zone website, where they have the digital resilience curriculum. So this is for today. Vicki, thanks a lot. Wish you a great week, and looking forward also to keep learning about your work and the work of Parent Zone. If you wish to
really nice
some parting words, feel free to.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.